On Wednesday, Connecticut became the 17th state, along with the District of Columbia, to do away with capital punishment. California is poised to move that number up to 18 with an initiative that would replace the death penalty with life imprisonment on the state's ballot in November. And when asked if they approve of the death penalty as punishment for a person convicted of a murder, a majority of Americans, 61%, said yes. But that number is also the lowest level of support for the practice in nearly 4 decades. Whatever your response, the death penalty undeniably forces us to confront other complex questions about morality, race, economics, and the legal system in our country. And one very simple question with a not-so-simple answer. Does death equal justice? Joining me now at the table, Vera Thomas, a mother whose son is on death row in Missouri. Jacoby, op-ed columnist for the Boston Globe. And Anthea Butler, professor of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Also from New Orleans, Scheck, co-director of the Innocence Project. Barry, I actually want to start with you because it'd be helpful if you could just sort of lay out for our viewers what the implications are if this death penalty initiative on the ballot in California goes forward.
Well, they're very significant. In the last 5 years, we've had 5 states that have repealed capital punishment. And what the Supreme Court ultimately looks at in deciding whether or not to invalidate capital punishment as a violation of the 8th Amendment is the trend of the states. And California is, in truth, the big enchilada. It has more people on death row, over 700, than any other state in the country. And I really think this ballot initiative is going to win. And the reasons have to do with what is driving the death penalty debate now. I don't think there's reasonable people can differ as to whether or not capital punishment is an appropriate sanction for the most heinous of crimes. But as the National Academy of Sciences just last week opined, there is no evidence that the death penalty deters. I think we have established now beyond any doubt that there is a serious risk of executing innocent people, and it is hideously expensive. In California alone, over the next 5 years, if they keep the death penalty, it's going to cost them $1 billion extra. Plus, every time that there's a death sentence in California, it takes 25 years before there's an execution. So the people that originally brought the death penalty back by amendment, a legislator named Briggs, Gil Garcetti, the former prosecutor in Los Angeles, the former warden of San Quentin, they're all against it.
So thank you. I mean, that's extremely useful. Now, Jeff, I want to turn to you. First of all, I apologize for getting your last name wrong, Jacoby. Jeff, it seems to me that there are sort of different bases on which one might oppose the death penalty. One is an issue of whether or not it should occur at all, regardless of whether or not someone is innocent or guilty of a crime. Another is whether or not it just is too expensive, right? So even if you think the death penalty is reasonable, if you think it's too expensive. But I think one of the critical ones that comes down in the American context is whether or not the death penalty serves as a deterrent for violent crime. And I know that you are actually a supporter of the existence of the death penalty. So sort of give us the other side on some of these arguments.
Well, in the first place, there's a lot of evidence, and there have been a lot of studies in recent years that draw exactly the opposite conclusion from what Barry Scheck was just saying, that indeed the death penalty is a deterrent.
No, it's not.
There are statistics galore that show that where capital punishment is abolished, murder rates climb. Where death penalties are imposed and enforced, murder rates come down. In this country, between the mid-1960s, when death penalty was basically taken off the table across the country as statute after statute was shot down by the Supreme Court, until the end of the 1970s, around 1980, when executions began again, the murder rate in this country exploded. It went from 9,900 murders to more than 21,000. So you just look empirically, when capital punishment is not an option, murder rates increase.
So Jeff, I want to pause there for a second because, you know, part of the challenge, obviously, is that we always have both time and the persistence of the death penalty occurring at the same time. So the climbing in the murder rate or the decline in the murder rate may have as much to do with economic factors, as much to do with other kinds of things. So we always can only see correlation. Right. And just quickly, we do have a criminologist, about 88% of criminologists disagree with you, right? And say say, in fact, no, we actually don't think that the death penalty is a deterrent. So it feels like there is evidence on both sides here.
2 points. One is that over the last 10 years, there have been study after study that have come out. Obviously, this is an issue that gets debated all the time.
Sure.
It's the kind of thing that people who are pro and con find themselves on opposite sides of.
Yeah.
What's interesting is when people who are on one side, who are opposed to the death penalty, look at these studies, look at the evidence, as for example, Cass Sunstein, who's an aide to President Obama, came out with a famous article a couple of years ago in which he said, boy, looking at all these studies that suggest that indeed there is a deterrent factor, maybe those of us who are opposed to capital punishment need to do some rethinking of our views. But beyond all of that, as somebody who does support capital punishment, my view isn't determined by whether or not it has a deterrent effect. And I suspect that for anyone who is strongly opposed to the to the death penalty, even if you could prove to them that it has a total deterrent effect, that might make many of them change nothing at all. If it's a moral issue, which I think for most of us on both sides of the issue it is, arguing about the practical effect, that's secondary. It's the moral issue that comes first.
That's a really interesting point. So Anthea, on that question of the moral issue, so sort of regardless of what the empirics show us, if this is a kind of fundamental question of who we are as a society, of what our values are, then where would you fall on that issue?
I would fall on the side of I don't support the death penalty, and I do think it is a moral issue. It's a moral issue because it speaks to what this nation is all about, first of all. It also speaks to a culture of life, and here I'm thinking, coming out of the Catholic tradition, about what that means, right? And so you take care of life at every segment. But I also think this also has a lot to do with, and people are not willing to talk about this, the prison industrial complex, and what that means for prisons to be able to house people for years and years and years on end. And especially, I lived in California for a long time, and it took forever for anybody to be executed. And then in Texas, the executions were just rolling around as a regular basis, and that's my home state. Yeah. So I think, for us, it's a moral issue. And I also think about what it would mean in this country for us not to do the death penalty. And I think about the case of Carla Faye Tucker. And this was a classic one. She was in Texas. She'd become a born-again Christian. It was Bush who was a born-again Christian. People appealed on her behalf. And I found myself sitting in a classroom with Jacques Derrida, and he was asking this question about why do Americans want to do this so much? And I said, I think it comes to a question of they believe in atonement, but they believe that they have people atone for their sins, so they must shed blood. And I think that is a fundamental issue for us in this country, is that the shedding of blood for people seems to think that that's going to fix everything, and it does not. It does not fix it.
Ms. Thomas, your son is on death row.
Yes, he is.
This is not a philosophical argument for you. It's a very personal one.
Very personal. I work in ministry, work with families, so I'm very much concerned about human life, period, as a whole. And one of the big issues I have with the death penalty is the fact that only a selective few receive it. You have thousands of murders per day. That's right. And yet we only have about 3,000 people on death row. So there's something has to be going on with the procedures and the process by which that happens.
Ms. Thomas, that is exactly where we're going to pick up as we come back. I want to talk about some of the evidence we have around the fairness and whether or not it is a fair policy, whether or not we think it's an ethical policy, but then also whether or not it is fairly distributed. We're going to continue right after the break, and we're going to talk about the murders of actress Jennifer Hudson's family. We're going to bring that into our conversation.
And I done made it through the struggle, don't judge me.